Assalamu alaikum. I would like to welcome all of you to the webinars of the Saudi Society of Medical Education's, the Riyadh chapters. As we always promised you to bring a subject really very interesting in medical educations. Today is no difference. All of us know assessment with all its type are important cornerstones of any training program. So the requirement of a good assessment system is a very mandatory. Many frameworks for a good assessment has been developed, including many concepts and strategy for assessment to include both individuals and assessment. And the best person to take us to this concept, the concept of assessment, is the expert in the field. It's my pleasure to present Dr. Thuraya Qattan. She is an MBBS. She has a PhD in medical educations, many publications in many educations, and she works in a very high dignitaries agencies related to postgraduate medical educations. And she is going to talk to us today about a new concept in the field of assessment called programs of assessments. And without further ado, I'm going to give the mic to Dr. Thuraya. However, if you have any questions, you can put it in the chat box. Otherwise, we're going to leave it for the end of the presentation. Dr. Thuraya, the mic is yours.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome and thank you for participating and joining us this hour. And thank you for the Saudi Society of Medical Education for inviting me to give this topic. I'm not sure if, I hope I'm good enough to give you this topic. I mean, it's a complicated topic. Maybe it started with during my PhD on validity and assessment. It's kind of, I think, a fairly new topic in the field. And I think it's something we're still growing and learning from. So I tried, because it's a complicated topic, I myself still find it complicated. I'm going to try to give you like the concepts and try to simplify it. However, if there's any further questions or concerns or any inquiries, you could feel free to ask like at the end of the session, or if something is not clarified while we're discussing. So I'm going to talk about programs of assessment. I'm just gonna, from now, I'm going to continue to calling it systems of assessment. Let me just see if the works. Okay. Just to clarify some things, maybe not to confuse it with other things. So I'm just going to go briefly, and most of the talk is going to be based on Prof. Norsini's article on the best practices on systems of assessment. He had the consensus paper coming out in 2018, which had the consensus framework for good assessment. And that framework came out maybe from the beginning, just like a brief history. In 2010, there was a paper that came out for criteria for good assessment for the single tool, so separate tools by itself. And then from that time till 2018, they had decided to see about talking about systems of assessment. And then in 2018, the group for the assessment conveyed and developed this paper. And I mean, I have to say, I have read it since 2018, and every time I read it up till this last weekend, I understand more stuff. So I will try to simplify things for you. So the paper and the definition, it defines systems of assessment as a system of assessment explicitly blends single assessments to achieve the different purposes, formative versus summative, high versus low, for a variety of stakeholders. So the idea is maybe we're usually used to having like before, let's say just MCQs or structured oral or OSCE, that's a single assessment. But this systems of assessment tries to look at these tools together as a whole system. And then you look at your summative. So let's say you have final exams, board exams, licensing exams. in respect to with your formative assessments, whatever formative assessments you have, either if it was OSCE or work-based assessment, in addition to other kinds of systems that are going to be implemented within this that's related. So if you have like portfolios or rules or regulation, so you're trying kind of looking at the whole thing. And I know it's called system of assessment, but I think it's been clarified like in the paper. And if you ever seen John Narsini's talk or any of the leaders and this, they would look at it maybe more as a framework or steps of doing stuff together. So if I'm just going to give some like quick introductions or let's say quick points regarding the systems of assessment. So just think about it like as a formal process. So it's like you want to go from A to B and you have lots of things that you have to think of. And this is maybe the main point of the assessment is to evaluate your students or your trainees, depending if you're undergrad or postgrad, their needs and their learning needs and curriculum effectiveness in their program. So you want to see what are the needs of the trainees, what are the competencies, what are the outcomes that they want, aligned with the curriculum, and make sure that at the end you achieve your objectives. It involves a lot of collecting and analyzing of data on how they achieve over time from the beginning till end. And the main idea is to see where their strength is, where their weaknesses are, and where areas of improvement, not just for the trainee, but on the how to improve feedback on your assessment, either if it was summative or formative, how to improve the curricula, how to improve the teaching. So it's a kind of a holistic approach to it. It involves it's more than just it's duplicated. Sorry, so it's more than just combining scores. So you have to think. It's not thinking about combining your OSCE scores with your structured oral, and then you come out with an average or you come out with a number to make a decision. No, it's kind of looking at all your results, all your performances, having a committee judgment, looking at all the results in like your portfolios, your rules and regulations, and then making a holistic judgment at the end. This is just like very holistically. So what it's not the same as collection of single assessments. So you can't have 5 or 6 tools and then you put them together and then you say there's a systems of assessment. It's not the same as programmatic assessment, because I think the word programs of assessment and system of assessment mean the same thing, but programs of assessment doesn't mean programmatic. It's a programmatic maybe is one kind of systems of assessment. There are other systems of assessment. So I'm just going to give you like some maybe examples so you could understand. So you could have a system of assessment that's admission. So admission or assessment for admission is as a kind of system. Programmatic assessment, which if some of you know, Kees van der Vloeden had like a leading paper on it, that's kind of systems of assessment. You could have licensing exam, that could be a systems assessment. And then you could have one that has everything. So you could develop your systems assessment that has components, which is admission, and then maybe you might have a component in the middle, which is programmatic, and then in the end it's licensure. So each one will be like a subsystem of a bigger holistic system. Like you're an organization, let's say like a regulatory body. So you might have more than one. If you're maybe a college or a university, you might have 2 or 3 of this, or one of them only. And again, it's not the same as curriculum mapping or assessment mapping. I think those are part of the systems of assessment. So there may be, there could be subsystems. So if you're going to talk about, let's say, programmatic assessment, where you're going to have like regular feedbacks and ongoing assessments, and then part of it, you might have work-based assessment. That could be a subsystem. And then with that, you have assessment mapping. So it's just kind of collecting all these maps and systems together and then think of it holistically, doing it at the same time. So it's like a mega blueprint, if you're going to think about it. So I think to understand, I took this, so the first framework that came out was talking about a single assessment tool. So one assessment tool. If you're going to talk about OSCE by itself or MCQ by itself or structured oral, they had a framework for those assessments, for single assessments. And then they had 7 criteria for it to be valid, for it to be reliable or reproducible. So to have equivalence, it would be feasible, it had educational impact, catalytic effects, and acceptability. I kept the definitions there. I'll try to explain it, simplify the definitions. So validity maybe might mean that, I think the simple definitions everyone knows is it tests what it's supposed to test, or it measures what it's supposed to measure. So if you want to measure clinical skills, you would have to have like OSCE, not MCQs. If you wanted to do knowledge, then you do MCQs. So you need to select the tool that's appropriate for your assessment. That's a very simple version of validity. The complex version is what you think about validity framework when you're talking about Mesick's framework or Keynes framework. You're going to go about to the whole process. And the whole process of validity and validity framework goes about quality assurance, most probably, from when you select who writes the items to how you gave them the workshop until you develop your exams, you develop the blueprint, you take your results, you validate those results, you do the post-psychometric analysis. That's the actual validity. That's the complex meaning. And just that's to say that your exam is valid. So that has to do with validity. Reliability or reproducibility has to do with consistency. So if you measure something one time and you repeat it again, it's always going to give you the same measurement. So if you take a test and you repeat this test 3, 4, 5 times on cohorts or different cohorts, it should reproduce kind of the same results. That's the simplest version. Of course, now reliability is part of validity framework, and it goes into more depth. It goes into, you have extensive, which is generalizability, like a tool can be reliable and can be valid, but it's usually valid and reliable just for that cohort, for that exam, for that purpose. If you want to generalize it, then you'd have to go to generalizability and other methods of assessment. The equivalence is the same. Assessment yields equivalent scores or decisions when administered across different institutions or cycle of testing. So you're going to it's kind of a different part of reliability where it's like a generalizability. This is the bigger concept that I was saying. Feasibility, it means if it's feasible. Is it easy? Is it practical to do? Can it be realistic? Giving your context, your background, your number of trainees in your program. So is it practical for you to do it or not? Because something might be practical for you, not practical for others. An MCQ, you might say it's practical, but then you might have a cohort of students that are there 2 or 3, and then will it yield good assessment or not? The psychometric might not be valid because it's a small number of students, so you wouldn't know the item analysis. So these are things we consider. You might say simulation is very good, but because it's very expensive, it's not feasible, or so on. The educational effect is that the assessment motivates those who take it or prepare for it. So when they say assessment drives learning, or assessment stimulates learning, so does it make the trainee want to go study or want to improve or want to learn? It depends on your system. So if you have formative assessment, purely formative, there's no mark, no attached to it whatsoever. So you're doing an assessment, or let's say formative assessment. Maybe let's clarify. I know it's the word assessment, but it's usually a learning event where you'd give like you could view. I'm just gonna say like mini CX, mini clinical evaluation. That's one of the formative assessment tool where you observe your trainee 15 minutes. Let's say taking a history, and then you give them feedback for 5 minutes. And areas of improvement, and that's not marked. So I might say that you're below expectation or you're borderline, but that's for you to know, for you to improve. However, it won't go in your marking. So that's purely formative assessment. So those formative assessment, when it's done purely formative, might drive the trainee to go to more consultants or more difficult or rigid consultants to see their feedback, because they know they're not going to be marked, and they know they're going to have honest, let's say, feedback. And that might drive them to, or motivate them to learn. So that's the educational effect. The catalytic effect, it provides, so the assessment provides results and feedback that motivates the stakeholders. So you get feedback from the results or from the analytics or from the post-analytic, the psychometric, and then that motivates you to improve your curriculum, to improve your remediation system, to improve the way your trainees are progressing, to improve your policies and procedures. And then acceptability, stakeholders, either trainees, trainers, regulatory body. I'm going to go into stakeholders, who they are, how do they process the results, because they need to know if it's credible or not, or it's feasible or not. So this is for the single assessment. So like when you had one tool. Now you're gonna most of these are the same for the systems of assessment. They might change in the wordings of it, but it's the same concept. So so these were in 2010 for single, and this is still valid up to now. So every single assessment tool should have these. Not all might be equal. It depends on your tool. So you might have, I'm just going to quick example, like MCQ might be, it's a very reliable tool. It's valid for knowledge, but maybe maybe its catalytic effect, maybe it's not as powerful as maybe if you did one of the formative assessment tools. So let's say if you take the Mini CX again, it might not be reliable as in the sense where you want it to be reliable, but it's very valid because it tests in the clinical field and so on. So all of these criteria, either for the single or the systems, will work as long as, but they might have different weights depending on your context. So for the criteria for the good assessment, for the systems of assessment, and I'm just going to give like an example. I want to just maybe the simplest system maybe you could think of generally. If you have your formative assessment throughout the year, and you have your summative at the end, and you want to combine these together, think of them as a system, one system. So you're not going to have people doing the formative assessment by themselves, and then the exam committee doing the summative, or the exam department doing the summative. They're all going to think about what the curriculum is, what the objectives are, and then they're going to develop together. So they make sure that anything is covered throughout the year is aligned with the final examination. So it's like one holistic thing. So this may be the simplest version. So the criteria for it is coherent, continuous, comprehensive, feasible, purpose-driven, acceptable, and transparent. So coherent means that it's composed of multiple tools. So that was a single tool, the first one, but this is coherent means it's multiple because it's no longer one assessment tool. You're going to assess your trainee from year 1 to year 4 in multiple rotations and multiple modules. So it has to have composed of multiple tools, different assessment methods, different performance. So that has to be coherent, and these have to be related to each other. So you're not going to have just knowledge, you're going to have knowledge, skills, and attitude tools for that. It has to be continuous. So you're not going to do one now and then one next year. No, it's going to be throughout the year. So it's continuous because every, let's say, module or block has outcomes and have objectives that need to be fulfilled, and some might be prerequisite to others. So your assessment tool in that way will be related to that. So you might have assessment tools prerequisite to some, maybe you need to do some before the other. Maybe I'm going to give it like a simple example. If you know, for the work-based assessment, DOPS, direct observation of procedural skills, where you look at the trainee doing a procedure for 15 minutes, that should precede a tool that's called PBA, procedure-based assessment, where you're going to look at the whole procedure. You might look at the whole procedure for a trainee who's R4 doing appendectomy. So you're going to evaluate him for the whole procedure from A to Z, from how he sterilizes to how he cuts the incision, how he removes the appendix, and how he closes it. That's the PBA. That would be at the end. But at the beginning of the year of the R1, you might just see him adopts. You might see him how he takes the informed consent. That's in one session. Maybe another session, you might see how he sterilizes and so on. So things have to be continuous. They should be comprehensive, because it means that comprehensive means it has to compose of knowledge, skills, and attitude, summative and formative. So it has all the assessment tools together. We're going to think about together. Feasible is the same idea, that it's practical, realistic, same thing. Purpose-driven. What's the purpose of your assessment? And I think maybe this is maybe the most highlighted or most important thing, if anything, like what's the purpose of this workshop? What's the purpose of the objective? What's the purpose of your assessment? I think this is where sometimes we attach more than one purpose for a tool, and this is where in the end we don't know to what you call it, like evaluate the trainee or pass or fail, because we had an objective for it to be formative, but then we put marks on it, then we made it summative, and so on. So that's very important. It should be acceptable for the stakeholders, so everyone accepts it and understands it and it's evidence-based, and then it should be transparent. So it has to be clear rules and clear ideas on where the rules of progression, what are the rules for making your decisions, and so on. So this is the general idea. Simply, I mean, this is also from the paper, how if you had no assessment, you'd be in the dark, and then how maybe 10, 15 years ago, we would have one single assessment tool that shows you where you are with your trainee, and then it developed into having more tools, but it's not aimed at like all the trainees. So you would have gaps on where to find your trainees' assessment or what are their skills. And then the system is selectively, like purposefully having all your tools shining at the trainee, or evaluating or looking at the trainee holistically from all aspects. So this is the simplest version of understanding. So it's not an isolated instrument or event. It's multiple opportunities and settings and raters and contexts that give you the idea. So when you call purpose of assessment, it's purpose driven. So this is also in the paper. So it tells you about if you have your formative and summative and what are the purpose for each one. So if you're just going to look at it, oops, 1 second. If you're going to look at it, okay. I was going to draw on it, but then. So if you're going to okay, so if you're gonna look at it for formative and summative, if you're gonna look at the formative aspect here, so if you're taking like validity, validity is valid for everything. So the validity for summative is same as formative. However, summative might be maybe more strict in certain areas. Your exam has to be very like reviewed in a very high stake exam. You have to make sure it's the questions are reviewed appropriately. When you come to formative, the validity might be choosing the appropriate tool. It might not have psychometric performance as the summative, so the validity might be different. If you're going to look at reliability, reliability is more heavy in summative, so your exam has to be reliable. So this factor is more available or more explained, or let's say emphasized in summative. But in formative, your tools might not be reliable in the sense you can't have a number. It's reliable because you have multiple tools, multiple sessions, multiple raters with different contexts. So that gives you the reliability. So having these multiple backgrounds adds to the reliability in the end. If you look at also the equivalence or the generalizability, it's more generalized in the summative assessment. Feasibility applies to both. You would find that the educational effect and catalytic effect, so what is the effect on the learning and the teaching of the trainee, formative has more higher implication than summative, because summative usually don't have feedback. You just do the exam and then you have missed opportunities on giving feedback, so you don't have multiple opportunities as you do in formative. So if you did this formative assessment, I give you feedback, you improve, I give you extra feedback again, you improve, and so on. So it has a better educational and catalytic effect. And the acceptability is usually acceptable for both. So the purpose of the assessment will drive how you choose your assessment tool and how you pull them together and doing it together, and how you construct your curriculum. Then you go to stakeholders. And the reason I'm going to stakeholders, just I'm going to show you quickly here, is because when you go back to the definitions, you'll find here acceptable by the stakeholders. Transparent, you have your stakeholders. The purpose has to do with the stakeholders. Feasible has to do with stakeholders. So well, these are people. Who are the people who are involved? So they talk about stakeholders because you have different stakeholders. You have internal, what they call internal and external. So the internal, like your trainees, your examinees, the educators, maybe the institution. Externals might be the regulatory body, accreditation body, the healthcare system, Ministry of Health, the patient, the community, because they might apply frameworks that say, let's say, the new modern model of care, or let's say the value-based medicine. These things might affect the way you are doing your curriculum or your systems, or you might have to have new tools or things to think of that might affect you. And so they highlight in the paper, if you have, these are the criteria of good assessment, who's interested in what. So your examinees are interested, so in summative exam, they're interested in the validity. Was my exam fair? Was it done appropriately? Was it written by high stake by good item writers? Was there no flaws? Was my test actually pass or fail? So they're more interested, let's say, in that summative validity if it was summative. Informative, they're interested in how to improve. So validity, coherence. So when you talk about the coherence, formative prevails here, because the coherence of your assessment, trainees don't want to depend maybe on one exam. They want to make sure that they have multiple chances, that you evaluate them not at the end of the year, but throughout the year. So examinees prefer to have formative, or let's say the validity or coherence is more dominant in the formative. Same thing as educational impact and catalytic impact. So this formative prevails there for stakeholders. So if you go to educators or institutions also like to have formative because that gives them more reliable things. For summative assessment, so the first row has to do with formative assessment and the second has to do with summative. Again, if you're going to say validity and reliability, it's more with the summative than the formative. Equivalence or generalizability, is this going to be generalizable to the next year or not? When you look to patients want the end result. They want to make sure that who you're graduating has appropriate, he's a competent physician. So they're going to look at the marks of the trainees. So they're not interested in the formative assessment aspects of the, let's say, the curricula.
If you're designing a system of assessment for the healthcare system, they're also thinking we want competent physicians. Regulatory body, they're saying, did you graduate competent physicians? So it depends on your system, who's your aim. So if you're doing licensing exam because regulatory bodies are going to see it in patients, so your system might focus on these part of the criteria rather than this part. If you're doing it for formative to improve, then you're going to focus on this area and so on. So this is for the summative and formative. Formatives usually take exams. They're usually opportunistic, so they arise according to the cases. And summatives, like at the end of the exam year or the end of the block, you want to tell them pass or fail. So then when you're going to go to the components of a system. So this might touch upon on the coherence and the comprehensive part. So you're going to have to think, okay, what am I thinking about? So you're going to think about your domains. If you're going to develop, let's say, a program, a formative assessment system with summative, and you want to think all together. So you're going to say, okay, I'm going to do it for an ER program from R1 to R2. What are the domains? I have to think about knowledge, skills, and attitude. What are the things that I want to measure? Therefore, you're going to think about your tools and your assessment methods. What kind of assessment methods do I need? Do I need multiple tools or not? Do I need to triangulate these tools? So I might have, if you're thinking maybe about preventive medicine or family, you might add into like reflective reports, feedback reports. You might have quality reports in it or community activities, volunteering. In ER, you might have less volunteering, or the volunteering in the emergency might be during Hajj or during having disaster or crowd medicine, then family. So you tailor and you choose your tools according to your program or what's the levels of your system. You have what they call boundaries, and it means it has to do what is the context. So if you're in a regulatory body or if you are a college or university, you're bound by what they tell you or what their rules and regulations are. So sometimes you want to do something that maybe you might not be allowed to because of rules and regulations, the way the system is put. Probably you might want to put like formative with no marks, but the rules are that you have to put marks and so on. So there are always like these constriction or boundaries that might affect. And it also affects maybe the trainees' background, where they're coming from. So if you're doing a licensing exam, international for international people, or you're going to do it just for graduates, undergraduate, these are going to affect how you're going to put your assessment or how you're going to design it. And then you have to think about the relationships and interaction. So if you're going to do, let's say we're going to do postgrad, am I going to take into consideration the undergrad, how they're the admission part of it? So I'm going to design it based on the undergrad. So let's say the undergrad is based on the framework of SaudiMed. So, okay, then I'm going to make my programs of assessment based, we're going to say that, okay, our programs are going to be competencies based on SaudiMeds. Therefore, our system, we're going to speak the same language, we're going to have the same idea, we just might tailor it to postgrad, and then you continue. Or you're going to see what are the tools that they have maybe in the internship. And then from there, you continue it or you adopt it. You might have things that maybe applied depending on the maturity of the medical schools. If you have those who have lots of medical education, their trainees might apply mini-CX and DOPS and different tools from undergrad, but when they go to postgrad, maybe they might not have that. So that's not aligned. So is it how you're going to align your systems together? So we're going to say we're going to align postgrad with undergrad or admission with intern and so on. And what are the interactions between them? So is this going to affect that? You could have it as simple. I'm gonna do the relationship and integration between summative and formative, so they can align together. Because once you do, because when we have it separated, sometimes you miss a lot of data, and then you won't be able to have the value of it, and this might not be efficient. It might be time and resources and that have been wasted. So that has to be thought of. You might also want to think about how is it related or not. So if you're going to think about your licensing exam, is it related to the postgrad? Is it something independent and so on? So you just need to think about, is there something before or something going to come after? How you're going to rate like your board exams or with your let's say fellowship. Let's say we're going to do a fellowship program and it's stemming out of a board. how we're going to supposed to integrate that. Maybe you should look at your board assessment tools. What are they? And then so when you develop your fellowship, you make sure that it's complementary, it continues, it's relatable. When you write your when you develop your systems or your competencies for that, it's aligned and so on. And then you have what you call other systems and roles. So once you have, say you have like your summative and formative, say I'm gonna align my summative assessment with my formative assessment. Are there other things that need to be aligned? Do you have e-portfolios that need to be aligned, that need to be integrated together? Do you have like a mentorship program that needs to say, okay, yes, we have a mentorship and we need to align it with the system. So you need to make sure that throughout the year they are we have mentorship rules or regulations or sessions to help with the formative, because we all know that formative needs a mentorship with them and needs an e-portfolio with them, and therefore all those data will be collected to pull in the decision making, in addition, let's say, with the summative assessment. You make sure you have your rules there. So there should be clear rules of progression. How does a trainee progress? Is it by marks? Is it by how they continue, how they perform better? Do you have rules or regulations for feedback or for sessions, intermediate sessions, for the remediation? Remediation, we mean like if trainees fail and then you don't want them to repeat the whole year or repeat the whole block. You say, no, they could maybe carry that block with them as long as they, and you make them a program that's tailored for them until they fulfill that criteria. So if you're, let's say, an example for a trainee, let's say one of the simplest, let's say they failed their taking a history, but you know that the next block they're going to take history. So you say, it's okay, he doesn't need to repeat the whole block. He can go to the second block and improve on their history, because that assessment is there. So you have some clear rules and regulations for that. The dynamic system. So because of all the changes, I mean, maybe the latest one is like the artificial intelligence and ChatGPT and what are the best evidence. These things affect how you do your systems and your assessment. So you might have a way of, like, you'd hear some schools going back to written assessment or going back to open book assessments because of the ChatGPT and so on, and all these artificial intelligence tools. So these will affect, or you might take into consideration now while you're doing your systems. These are other systems that affect how you develop your or think about your assessment, summative and formative. Purposeful blueprinting, it means it's driven or by the desired outcome. And maybe they call it blueprinting here. Some of you might hear it as assessment mapping. So you're going to make like a huge map on the assessment, on how you look at it. So you could do it by rotations, you could do it by blocks, you could do it by, if they're EPA, then you could do it by EPAs. I'm just going to show maybe just to visualize something, like this is just an example. If you go into the McMaster, you just put assessment mapping McMaster, you'd have things. So you might have competencies, you might have it simple on having it here. What is your assessment, or is it an inpatient or outpatient? And then you have what does X means, what doesn't mean. You might have it detailed according to let me just show you another one here. You might have it simple like this, where you link it to the with your competencies, your EPA, and what they need, and then what do they need from here. So they need to fill Form 1 and Form 2. What is Form 1 and Form 2? You might have it somewhere like this. So you might have your OSCE here. You might have your work-based assessment here. You might have your mini CX and MCQ. So you might have different ways of assessment mapping. Just a simple way just for you to understand. And that would be incorporated within your systems of assessment. So that's one thing of to consider, and making sure that it's linked together. So one of these main points maybe cover how it becomes coherent and comprehensive. When they're talking about continuous from the criteria, it means it's ongoing. So if you have any program, so I'm just giving, for example, residency from R1 to R4. Let's say here it's from R1 until R4. Usually, or let's say in the undergrad from year 1 to year 4, usually they start with the big bulk of knowledge. So you find them having more knowledge and then maybe less clinical sessions. But as they go and they build on their knowledge, and the knowledge maybe decreases more because it's now translated into having more clinical and practical skills, you'd have to have a way of assessing this, or showing how to demonstrate the performance of the trainees from the beginning of the year to the end. And when we're talking, it has to be tailored to the level. It should be that you would have maybe here you'd have more MCQs, maybe you'd have a long case history, you might have like an OSCE, but as you go, you'd have more work-based assessment, more clinical skills, more practical skills, and more simulation. And then, so this might be where we're talking about continuous and tailored to level, and it's aligned. You might then go from residents to fellows. You might start your fellowship having something totally new. It has nothing to do, but if they were related, then you would have to align it with what we call what you had in your board. So this is where we're talking about integrating and making sure it's coherent and relatable, and it's like a puzzle. So it's continuation. So whatever tools I had here, let's say I had lots of DOPS, and then at the end I had a starting of procedure-based assessment. So here you're going to have more procedure-based assessment, more stuff. You might then have more skills that you want to add, new skills. You might have teaching skills, you might have leadership skills, managerial skills that you're going to add here, and then you build on it because you want to improve their attitude or your behavior and so on. So this is how you think about it when you're building your system. So this is where you say you're going to integrate. So I'm going to integrate, if I'm doing a fellowship program, I'm going to think, oh, okay, so I had a board before, so I'm going to think about the relationship and the interaction between these. So this is maybe just one of the examples that I forgot to put the link here, but there's they were talking about how the performance, how you look at your competence and your system related. So this is when you go more advanced for Miller's pyramid. They look at not just individual, you have to look at it as a system as a whole, and your competence and your performance as a whole as you go and advance. I'm going to just talk out quickly about the challenges. I'm going to try to give like a quick demonstration on, let's say not demonstration, like a visual look at how it might look. But I think the challenges, because it's a complex, maybe not a complex idea, it has multiple factors and multiple stakeholders and definitely multiple departments. So if there's not, I think one of the main challenges if the purpose of the assessment of what you're doing is not clear to everyone, and the goals and objectives are not clear, and they're not aligned with everyone, then this is maybe one of the major problems. I say again, if your purpose is not clear and it's not reminded every single, you have to often remind, because I think we always tend to say, yes, it's formative, and then we go out and make it summative, or we say this is summative, and then we add different tools, and then we forget why we made the exam or why we did our assessments or our the purpose of the system as a whole. And I think we always have to remind ourselves. The other thing is the purpose might shift. So you might put something as, let's say you're going to say within the first year, I'm going to have MCQ, a final exam at the end. During the middle, I'm going to have progress testing, where you're going to do an exam multiple times to see if the trainees progress. You might have it marked, but then while you're making marks, there are too many marks or too much failure, and then you understand that the progress testing was to see them progressing. It wasn't to see if they pass or fail. It was to see how are they progressing in order for you to identify those who are not, to give them feedback. So then you say, okay, I'm not supposed to put marks on there. And you're supposed to remove them. So sometimes your purpose shifts over time because the intention was to do something, and then you realize it's something else. It could be, it's change of rules, it's change of regulations, new trends, and so on. And the other thing is you might have dual purposes. So you might have an assessment that's acting for both or two purposes. So like we say it's formative assessment, but then at the end, we make a judgment if they pass or fail. Even if we say it's low stakes and there's no marks during the formative, but at the end, I say if you do 6 satisfactory, then you're borderline. So at the end, I'm kind of putting a mark on it. So sometimes when we do this, we have two double purposes for it, and most of the time, I think most of us do that, and it could be because of the rules or the regulation doesn't work. So this is where you might think, okay, we might revise that. We need to have purely assessments that are not marked, and then at the end, this is how you're going to mark. You could have the same things like in the EPAs or in your competencies and so on. So you'd have to think, what is the purpose? Is it for marking? Is it for progression? Is it to identify learner? Is it for licensing? Is it for admission? And then you try to stick to those rules and make it very clear. You might have mis or mal-alignment with learning outcomes. So you have your competency written, you have your teaching methods written, but then we have the assessment that are not matching. And I think we all fall in this kind of trap. We write everything, we make sure that the objective is written appropriately, we use the Bloom's taxonomy appropriately, but then when we come to the assessment, we find that we're doing summative for formative, formative for summative, and so on. So that has to be fixed. maybe over assessment. Sometimes we overshoot to say we need to do formative. We do so many tools that we're exhausting the trainee and the trainers, and we lose purpose of what to do in it. And this is where you have to think, is it feasible or not? Maybe I should reduce and so on. Maybe I need to increase the number of trainers and so on. Another thing might be you might have so many single assessment tools that become trivial. So you might say, I have all these formative, but in the end, I'm going to make my judgment on the summative. And then that removes the value of like your formative throughout your either year. And then these are some things that we have to consider. You might underutilize assessments or results. So we have so many assessment data, but we're not looking at the correct one, or we're not appropriately managing the data, or looking at what we should improve next year, or what part of the curriculum or assessment that we need to drop and things we need to adapt and discover and try. I think one of the interesting things that was said that maybe we always, the traditional assessment, we usually stick to it because it's easily done, or because this has always been the way to do it. And this, when we stick to that, we tend to not do the assessments that are difficult to measure, and the competencies that are most important in clinical practice, which has to do with professionalism, patient safety, communication, health advocate, and so on. And that's because it's easier for us to do MCQs and to do like OSCEs, and it's been there in the field. It's easy to measure, it's reliable, it's valid, there are scores, and make decisions on it, as opposed to doing so many formative assessments and then aligning it with the summative, and then valuing. If I have 100 data formative that are telling me that my trainee is good, and then I have one summative exam that's telling me he's bad, but we put the value on that summative, does that summative outvalue the hundreds of data that tell you opposite? So this is where we have to check. And then maybe maybe most challenges is that we don't have insufficient, so we have insufficient resources, either human or time or finance. So if we're going to try to put it together, so if you have your system, or you have like your two systems, let's say here you have undergrad and you have postgrad, and you're going to have formative here, and then you're going to have summative in the middle, and you're going to have formative and summative, and then you have all these blocks there. I'm just trying to think. And then you have your competencies. So you have your competencies based on the CAN-MEDS, all on the same framework. So you know that these are related. So whatever ends here, here I might improve on it, or I might be more in depth in it. And then you have your tools. I just gave like simple examples. You make your tools. You have to make sure that your tools are appropriate for the blocks. So let's say procedures are DOPS. Yes, surgery has procedures. Okay, I didn't put surgery here, procedures here. Maybe I should have a red dot here for procedures. Critical care has, and so on. And you look where are the opportunities to have, and so on. And then you have to make sure that the other systems, the observation and feedback part, is there mentoring or not? Is there an e-portfolio or not? Is there data for progression? Is it implemented? Did you think about it or not? Do you have one evaluation, or do you have regular evaluations? Do we have multiple points where committee come and they say, okay, you're doing well, and then they give you evaluations that are you progressing appropriately? Is it diagnostic? No, you might see that you're not doing well. Is it prognostic? They tell you, you know what, if you continue like this, you're gonna fail. Or is it like, say, remediation, where you're gonna have to repeat? And then do you have like another final evaluation? So do you have multiple points where committees check and give you progression with your mentorship program and so on? So that's generally putting it together. This is just a way of looking at progression. Maybe I always put this, that if you have like generally let's say 3 months, and then you see your trainees. So if you're looking at your system, this is like an evaluation for one trainee, just one trainee. And you see like at the end of the 3rd month, so these are by months, and this is the rating tool, this is the rater. So this is the rater here, these are the marks for the rater. So you'd see, because it's required for them to do formative assessment, they just do it at the end of 3 months. Yes, I completed my mini 6 and my DOPS and whatsoever, and just give it because it's a checklist for them to do. And then you would see the raters, because it's asked for them to do, they just rate everything so high. And then the pattern keeps repeating every 3 months, where the trainee just fills the tool because that's the point, because we're not looking at the data appropriately. The purpose of it maybe was not, we said it's formative, but because in the end they know that the final exam, that's where they're going to look at the marks, so therefore they just do it anyway. And then the trainers might say, or not appropriately evaluate the trainee, or they fail to fail them, or they fail to give, let's say, honest feedback, so they just put anything. But what you want to see, your system should, if you have your, if this is a system that wants to see trainee progression, so you're looking at them improving from year 1 to year 2, then if you look at the same 3 months for the same trainee, it should look like from day 1 he tries to attempt to do a case-based discussion. And this trainer honestly gives him feedback and says, you know what, because you're at the beginning of your year, you're a 3, or you maybe he's an R2, so he had an R1 case-based discussion, he knows how to do it. But maybe when he did the mini CX, he was a 2 because it was a new case, it was a difficult case, it was a case has to do with breaking bad news, is a new skill, and therefore the trainer was honest enough to give the trainee a feedback of an evaluation of 2 because it's unmarked. He got feedback here, he get another session with another trainer or the same trainee, improved, and so on. It's also a way to see if the trainee dips. Why did they dip? Was it something very difficult? Was it an evaluator who was not appropriate? Did the trainee go some mental or emotional state here where you want to pick him up, and so on? And where progression, so means that you see the trainee go, their progression goes up and down. You should see trainees always trying to go up. You should try to avoid, I mean, if you see the trainees going down, that's a flag. If you see trainees plateauing and maybe not interested, maybe that might say, okay, you need to improve on something. So this is kind of where you look at the data, how it helps in developing your system. Of course, if this is a licensing exam, your tools are going to be different. You're going to have your form is going to be different. You're going to have a graph that says pass and fail, and then you want a rate of people passing and people failing, and so on. So maybe in summary, if you just want to look at it in general, you'd need to think about the purpose. So identify your purpose of your single assessments, and then your systems of assessment. So if you're doing formative throughout the year and summative, and you want to do them together, so your system of assessment is putting the formative and summative together. So you're going to say, okay, these are my single tools separately. Each one has a purpose. So the MCQs for MCQ, OSCE is OSCE. OSCE is not OSPE. OSCE is not structured oral exam. It is not a paper-based exam. It's not a short answer question. It is actually an OSCE. And then you look at it all together, the whole system. So you say, okay, I'm going to do an OSCE maybe 2 times a year. In the meantime, I'm going to do multiple mini CX and DOPS and case-based discussion. Therefore, when I do my OSCE, technically speaking, I should say my trainees are doing appropriately, because I like to think of OSCE as multiple work-based assessment put in one session, because you would have history taking as kind of a mini CX, you might have a procedure which is kind of a DOPS, you might talking about a case which is a case-based discussion, if you're going to think about it simplistically like that. So that helps you to develop your systems. And then you say at the end of the year, I have a MCQ. But let's say your trainees failed in the end of the year because during the year they were not trained, or you didn't cover the MCQ. So you say, okay, I might do quizzes throughout the year, or I might do progress testing to see how they go, to see if they understand the knowledge, that they know how to take MCQs. And then this is where you link your single assessments with your multiple and holistically together. I think one thing you have to consider, you can't have your summative assessment detached from your formative. So if you have OSCE, a long case, or MCQ at the end of the year, by default, you should have it there throughout the year so your trainees understand what it is. They're not surprised. They know how to deal with this, and so on. So it has to be linked and aligned together. And this is how you connect them together. The other thing, you would think about the connection. So what are the relationships of these systems? So the formative with the summative, the undergrad with the postgrad, the R1s with the R2s, the intern with the admission, and so on. So this is how you look at the relationship depending on what you're talking. You're talking a big system, or you're talking maybe a simple system with just work-based assessment. Your system might be as small as just work-based assessment, just summative assessment. And what are the interactions across these systems? So are they connected to each other? Are they connected to different kinds of systems of assessment, or different kinds of what you said, other rules and regulations? So related to progression, related to mentorship, and so on. And then you think about the clarity. So as I said, if you have something so big, so let's say a regulatory body who deals with undergrad, deals with postgrad and admission, and then they have these residents and fellows and diplomas, and they need to connect them. They have to think about that. So they might say, okay, we're going to have boards by themselves, fellows by themselves as subsystems. We see what the connection between that. Maybe in the residents, they say, okay, we have in their subsystems of work-based assessment, we have portfolios and so on. So you make them into smaller systems, and smaller just for you to understand and comprehend and make sure it's all related to each other and related to the curriculum and so on. You need to have like create maps, whatever the maps are, so either blueprinting map, curriculum map, assessment map, and make sure they're all integrated together, they're all aligned. Your rules and regulations are attached, your accreditation standards are attached. And I think one of the most important thing is communicating to your stakeholders, because what your trainees want why you're making the system. You might have your system very good and set up and you understand why it is, but wasn't explained. It wasn't explained to the trainers or the trainees or what was the information that's relevant to explanation. So you might say to your trainees, what we need you to do, informative assessment, these are the forms to fill. You need to be self-driven. You need to go look for this information and look for the not information. Let's say trainees are responsible for their formative assessment. So they have to go to the trainer, say, I need to do mini CX. They need to know where their weaknesses are and weakened procedures. So I need to go make more DOPS and so on. Maybe you need to tell them to your summative, your exams are reliable. They're going to be according to blueprint. So that's for the training. For your trainers, you might tell them, okay, because we made the system, so these are more information. This is how you do your mini CX. Why do we doing the mini CX? This is the purpose of it. You give explanation, you give workshops, you give training. These are all part of things you need to factor in when you do it. Because if you're going to do any systems or any assessment and you're not explaining to the trainee what they're supposed to do, or to the trainer, then the system will fail no matter how good it looks, because at the end it has to do with stakeholders. And then you get feedback on them to improve. And then maybe the last thing, it has to do a lot with quality assurance and regulation and how we're going to do your validity in general, which is maybe a bigger topic. But this is maybe just generally how to think about it, or how to think about systems of assessment. So I tried to make it simpler. It's I think each point is a chapter by itself, and I'm not sure about everything. I don't know everything, but I'll try to help or explain if there's something wasn't clear regarding the topic.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thuraya. It was really brilliant. And as you said, it's comprehensive. It's a new concept. I'm sure there's lots of questions is roaming around from the attendees. So any of the attendees, should you have any questions, please open your mic and you can forward your questions to Dr. Thuraya. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Thuraya.
Hello, Dr.
Farah. Thank you very much for a very great presentation and new information. I just wanted to know that for this systems assessment, do we have any template available, or we got to develop it on our own, depending on the systems which prevail in our organization?
Yes. So there isn't one template. That's right. So if you look at the article, they're just going to give you what it is generally. So if you're talking about, let's say you wanted to do assessment mapping, or let's say you want to do formative and summative, then I would say you would have to look at templates for assessment mapping, taking into consideration the rules and regulations or the criteria for good assessment. So it's mainly thinking about what are the frameworks, what you want. You have, like, if you go to, let me just see if I'll show you like a framework. If you know the programmatic assessment, they have clearly outlined and they show it on how to do the programmatic assessment. Your licensing exam, final exam, that's going to be in regards to how you do your blueprinting. So there's not one thing. And this is why I think it's complex, because it is not something you actually kind of see. It's like you have multiple documents with different departments, and you have to think it together. So where you have committees and saying, okay, this is what we're going to do. And then you try to, all of you have the same rules and purposes. And then when you're developing let's say if you're from the exam committee and you're doing your blueprint for summative, you are going on the same criteria and rules when I'm doing my formative. And then you make one huge blueprint, let's say, how it's attached. So you can say this competency is taught multiple times here in our formative, and you make this assessment mapping like the one I showed you, let's say in the McMaster one. And then so when you're doing your final exam, you say, yes, I have an OSCE station there. No, I'm not going to put this because you covered it so much informative, therefore I'm not going to do, I don't need to add it. So it's not one framework, as more people talking and going on the same, making sure that everything is aligned. So people who write the curriculum make sure that it's reflected very appropriately when you're doing your blueprinting and your formative. So everyone is on the same page.
Great, thank you. There is a question from Prof. Ali Sha'lan. He said, Dr. Thuraya, how does the system program ensure it accommodates and fairly evaluates students with a diverse learning styles, backgrounds, and needs.
Okay, so I think this is where we go, I think, to validity. Because if you're asking, so you're asking about, so I think one of the big topics about systems assessment is you have to provide evidence. And when you're talking about evidence, you're talking about across lots of documents, it's like when somebody's accrediting a hospital, they're going to do accreditation, same thing, like you're going to accredit your system. What are the documents? So you're going to say, for my exam, what framework are you using? So there's multiple validity frameworks. You have Keynes framework, you have MESICS framework, you have the standards for education measurement framework. And those go into so many details from, as I said, creating your committee. Who did you choose? Who are the backgrounds of your committee? What workshop did you give? What is the topic of the workshop? What are the materials that you gave in the workshop? What were the questions? What were the item flows? So you give evidence on each one. You say, yes, I chose appropriate people, or let's say physicians. They had the medical education background. They were trained in assessment, they took the MCQ workshop, we did the questions, we did item writing flaws, we checked the psychometric analysis. We didn't do this, and you justify why you didn't do it. So it's like you're in a court of law. You have to justify what you did and what you didn't do, and you provide the evidence. And then in the end, based on that, when you make your decision of pass and fail, you say, because of the evidence that I've shown you and I gave you, therefore it is there. For trainees, for performance, usually there's what you call performance analytics. So you have an e-portfolio or a system where your curriculum objectives, or they say curriculum mapping, is embedded in this online platform. So I know that this competency is going to be evaluated by across Mini-CX and across, let's say, in-training evaluation reports and case-based discussion. The system calculates it for you. So it's going to calculate my communication and my written communication case-based discussion with the communication aspect in the Mini-CX, with the communication aspect in something else, and it calculates and tells you where my weaknesses are. But this one you'd have where you need this analytics, performance analytics, a system, online system, an actual system where it connects all this together. So again, the systems of assessment, definitely you would need an online system where you put all this data and it calculates it for you.
Well, brilliant. There's a question was asked Dr. Sumira Masood, and she says, please tell us what is the most appropriate assessment tool for the values and attitude in undergraduate students.
Okay, so I think this is maybe one of the complex. I think if anyone's seen, or if you can see the the conference for Royal College, I think it was a couple of months ago. They were talking about the valued one, the health advocate, and these soft skills. These are most of the very difficult tools to assess. And I think the conclusion is the best tools are like the multi-source feedback, the peer feedback, the feedback that you get from multiple people on their values. It's not how you ask them in the exam or something. You'd have to have multiple raters from like different backgrounds or peer assessment to do that. Some of them are the peer assessment tool. Some of them is self-reflection also, that they self-reflect and you see them. But I think the multi-source feedback, I think that's like maybe the strongest tool available to try to use it, either undergrad or postgrad.
Great. I don't see any further questions in the chat box, and I don't see anybody just took the mic and want to ask any questions. I think we come to the end of our webinar today. At the end, I want to thank the attendees for their valuable participations and asking the questions. Also, I want to thank Dr. Thuraya for this very interesting concept, and it is going to be overwhelming throughout the medical education's process in the future. Thank you very much, and see you in the next webinars in February, and we will talk about feedback. Thank you very much, and have a great evening, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Good night.